QSO Today, episode 442, Orv Beach, W6BI. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Volts magazine. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I was a guest of RTTY, the Radio Amateur Training, Planning, and Activities Committee, on Wednesday night, and a new podcast called DX Mentor, hosted by Bill AJ8B, a QSO Today guest in episode 319, and Joe W8GEX yesterday. If you are interested to see how I behave as a guest on another podcast, I will put links into this week's show notes page to get to these podcasts. Special thanks to Ham Radio Workbench podcast hosts George KJ6VU and Vince VE6LK for putting out a special 6-minute segment promoting the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming in 2 weeks from this posting on March 24th, 2023 at 1800 PDT. That's Pacific Daylight Time, where both the Ham Radio Workbench podcast and RTTY will have up to 3-hour live streams at the expo. If you have not yet purchased your ticket for the expo, the ticket price is $15 to attend the entire weekend, where we have over 40 presentations and panel discussions, as well as our new integrated roundtable lounge that allows you to network and socialize with your fellow hams by sponsor, subject, and lots of open tables for schmoozing with your old friends and new friends. All the presentations, once presented, will be available on replay for the 30-day on-demand period. VFairs, our expo platform service provider, now has a new mobile application for both Apple and Android for smartphones and tablets. If you want to attend the expo while being mobile or portable, then get this free application by going to the expo website at qsotodayhamexpo.com and click on the mobile app menu item at the top of the website. It has lots of cool features that allow you to access all of the expo and expo attendees. The app does not yet include the roundtable networking forum, but it will be added in future expos. Download the application and put in the email address that you used to buy your expo ticket. The app will know how to configure itself around the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. Just a note on VFairs. VFairs has been an amazing partner to QSO Today and has implemented into their product roadmap all of the features that I've requested over the last 2 years. They have a great interest in QSO Today, as we are on the cutting edge of delivering content to a special community. The economic model of the entire QSO Today project is changing. After almost 6 years of commercial sponsorship, we will rely on listener support beginning in April. More on this development in later podcasts. QSO Today now relies on your support to continue. This model is called Value for Value, created and coined by the Podfather and creator of podcasting, Adam Curry, KF5SLN. If you think that the QSO Today podcast, Expo, and other QSO Today projects have value to you, please first buy a ticket to the Expo and, when you can, donate the amount of value that QSO Today gives to you. This will keep my head down on the QSO Today projects and convince the XYL that QSO Today must continue. Orv Beach, W6BI, has had a love of electronics and radio since his pre-teens. Orv has always preferred the digital modes of operation, starting first with CW, ham radio's first digital mode, then proceeding on to RTTY, packet radio, Pactor, Winlink, and now AREDN. W6BI built and maintains a comprehensive AREDN mountaintop network in Los Angeles and Ventura Counties in California, lectures extensively to amateur radio clubs around the world on how to get on this latest digital mode. Orv Beach W6BI is my QSO Today. W6BI, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Orv?
This is W6BI. I copy you 5 by 5.
Orv, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Oh, gosh. We're going way back here. Well, if you want to start at the very beginning, when I was about 16, my grandmother had to move out of her home. And as a result, I wound up with her radio, all tubes in a wooden case. It was that long ago. AM and shortwave. So I got into shortwave listening, threw a long wire up in the big tree in the backyard and a ground rod, and had a great time listening all over the world. But one day I heard a ham net on 160 meters, AM back then. It piqued my interest, and I started reading up about electronics and radio. I think one summer I'd found a book, I think it was written in 1938, on receiver technology. And I spent the summer reading it, I guess between junior and senior grades in high school. And I'd read 10 or 12 pages, rewind six pages, and start all over again. But by the end of the summer, I had a basic concept of receiver theory and started studying ham radio. And I graduated way back in 1967. But before I graduated, the electric shop teacher gave me the novice test. A buddy and I took it. We both passed. He never went any farther. Back then, you had to wait for your license to come in the mail. And I was fortunate enough to have an old National NC 303 and Viking 2. I got them from my uncle. I think he used them on CB. So anyway, waiting for my license to come in the mail, I listened to Morse code. I was graduated out of high school, had a summer job, and my dad had built a playhouse in the backyard when we were kids, and I claimed it as my ham shack. So I'd come home from work, and before I went in the house, I'd go out in the shack and turn the radios on, let the tubes warm up while I had dinner, and then I'd go back out and I'd listen to CW, for 2 or 3 hours a night on the air.
On your QRZ page, then, that's the picture of the Viking 2 and the National NC 303?
That is it, in my teeny little ham shack.
So I'll reference the QRZ page. What was the hometown?
Oh, it was Montebello in the San Gabriel Valley, east of downtown Los Angeles.
So Montebello, California, right near La Puente?
Little west of La Puente, but yeah.
I know it well. Well, I used to live there, so.
I enjoyed growing up in the San Gabriel Valley. We had a great time.
The best Mexican food, I think.
Absolutely. J&S burritos. Just south of the Pomona Freeway, just east of Garfield. We make a stop there anytime we're in that area.
So you're in high school between your junior and senior year. You get your novice license. Now, you said that the electronics shop had some resources, but did your school have a ham radio club or a ham radio station?
Not to my knowledge. I think the electric shop teacher would have mentioned it. I never heard about it. Too bad. It would have been fun. So anyway, it took a number of weeks for me to get my ticket in the mail. WN6WEY, horrible call sign for CW, or voice for that matter. So I finally got my license, and every night after dinner, I go out there and I do Morse code until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. I kept learning about electronics, and my first project was a 2-tube electronic keyer, 2 12AX7s, and I needed a paddle for it. My parents had given me a Vibraplex, which I tried and didn't care for, so I didn't tell them, but I hacked it up into a single paddle keyer, single paddle for the keyer, and it didn't do iambimation or anything like that, but I cranked my speed up, and my second project was a QSK break-in between the two, the radios, receiver and transmitter, so I could do full break-in and had nightly rag chews with my buddies in the San Gabriel Valley. And over the course of, a couple of years, my speed went up quite a bit.
Did you belong to a ham radio club as a teenager?
Not at that time. Years later, I did my first I don't want to get ahead of myself, but first ham club I joined was the Pacific Telephone Ham Radio Club after I got out of the Navy. Went back to work for Pacific Telephone.
Let's stay on the track then. So you're going through high school, you've got your novice license, you're getting your CW speed up to 20 words?
I copied a 30-word per minute broadcast from ARRL at one time, and regrettably I didn't send it in and get the certificate, but that's water under the bridge. I got the gear, got my license. Let me think. I took the test in March, had some equipment problems, got on the air in August, passed my general in December. The following December, I got my advanced. And a year after that, I flunked the extra. In between, I got interested in girls, and my ham radio activity dropped off significantly. Went in the Navy in 71, and I was electronics tech, and the electronics tech A school at that time was on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. It had had a ham radio station since, I don't know, the late 40s. When I arrived there, they had moved the ham radio station, which was a wonderful, wonderful two-story building on the edge of the bay with a 110-foot tower. They basically ejected them out of there because they were going to build Navy housing on that area, and said, you can have this 100 by 40-foot single-story building in the middle of the island. When I got there, everything was just piled up inside, and it had been used as a training school, so there was benches and soldering irons and all sorts of stuff. So I and the other hams who were there at the time, some were students, some were stationed there, wonderful bunch of guys. I'm still friends with some of them, made it into a ham radio station. Rooms for this, rooms for that, a patch panel, no antennas except a couple dipoles. Funny story, the local facilities group was going to take down the 110-foot tower, move it over for us. The day they were doing that, the facilities manager was having lunch with the commander of the base. And if you're familiar with Treasure Island, the Oakland Bay Bridge goes through a natural island called Goat Island. It's elevated quite high. And the officers club was up there, and they could see the whole island. And the facilities manager was pointing out the crane attached to the tower and telling the commander how proud he was that the group was going to take this on. So anyway, they attached the crane to the middle of the tower, undid the guy wires, not knowing that the heavy-duty rotator for the 40-meter beam and everything else on it weighed over 120 pounds, and they'd attached the attached the crane below the center of gravity. So they undid the bolts at the bottom. The tower turned sideways, bounced a few times, and crumpled into a pile of metal, just destroyed. And the commandant turned to the facilities manager and says, you are going to replace that, aren't you? So anyway, being around since before World War II, as you came off of Goat Island onto Treasure Island, there had been a seaplane hangar right on the ocean, and they had about 100-foot self-standing tower, a tapered tower, four-sided. So they cut that down, or took it down, poured us a base. They carved out a 10 by 10 by 10-foot hole next to our brand-new ham radio station, which, by the way, they had to pump because the salt water kept seeping into it. And they poured a base for the tower. And while they did that, all of us hams painted the sections, primed and painted all the sections. I don't know, 4 or 5 20-foot sections. So it was all hands on deck for that. A lot of fun. So anyway, they had the electronics technicians from the base, the civilians, put the tower together, and they wired up the rotator, and they put up the antennas. 204BA, wide space 20-meter beam, and I think there was 15 on top of it. Got everything wired up, redrew straws to see who got to use it first. So Dave, WB6RHQ was his call sign at the time, CW op, cranked the beam over towards Europe, heard an SP6 calling CQ, Polish, gave him a call, and got buried by dozens of Germans calling him. That was a fantastic sight. Saltwater ground plane for miles around. Just had a great time.
I saw there was the Drake twins.
Yes. Oh, those actually belong to Glenn, WA0VPK was his old call sign. I misremember what his call sign is now. Anyway, still friends with him, and he took the picture of me there. Just had a ball. Behind that wall, there was another room that became the RTTY room. It was about 10 by 20, and I don't know if I have a picture of that on my ham site or not. It was the drive? HT37 driving a homebrew 600-watt amplifier, going to the 204BA, put out a pretty good signal. The amp was actually capable of doing a kilowatt, but when we ran a kilowatt at 100% duty cycle, the plastic around the coils would soften. So we had to dial it back to 600 watts. And it was kind of interesting. The Navy had a teletype demodulator. It was actually two demodulators with a comparator stacked in between. And the comparator would get the DC signals, marks and spaces from the two demodulators and compare them and pick which one was best. So we had two receivers. One was a Collins 75A4, and the other one was some military thing. The Collins was transceiving with the HT37 to typically the beam, and we had an untuned 33-foot whip on the side of the building, and that went to the other receiver. And it was so much fun watching the signals fade. Most of the times, the beam had the better signal, but once in a while it would take a fade, and this untuned vertical would have a better signal, and we could copy almost 100% almost all the time. So anyway, I got turned on to RTTY there.
If we're talking RTTY, for those that are maybe in the know, what was RTTY, and how does it differ maybe from these days from the teletype that we might be doing now?
Well, RTTY is obviously radio teletype. Quite an old digital code. It actually is Baudot code, which is 5-level code. B-A-U-D-O-T. I think that's French. There's no one-to-one comparison between ASCII. It had its own. Being 5-bit, everything was capital letters. There was no extra code space for lowercase. So you got letters, uppercase letters, numbers, and a few punctuation marks, and that was it. And it was a mechanical machine. The early machines were the Model 15 teletypes. Later on, it was the Model 28s. And the picture, I don't know if I'm in the picture at a Model 28. Those are mechanical machines. You can't type faster than 60 words per minute because the keyboard isn't ready any faster than that. And it was all mechanical. Fascinating machines to watch.
Orv, did you do RTTY enough that because I've had some people claim that at a certain point they could tell by listening to Baudot on the air what was coming in. Could you actually decode it in your head?
Not all of it, but I recognize CQ and I recognize my call sign and maybe a couple of other call signs that I talk to a lot. It's not that fast.
It's two tones, mark and space.
Yeah, 170 hertz apart. I took that interest in radio teletype with me once I became a civilian. Actually, I started using RTTY while we were still in the Navy. I was newly married in a World War II duplex in Kittery, Maine. Our submarine was in overhaul in Portsmouth. And my wife, bless her heart, she let me put my RTTY station in our bedroom.
Good for her.
Not only that, it was in the adjoining wall to the other half of the duplex. Fortunately, the man who was in there was on my crew in my submarine, and he was an electrician. So I tried not to run RTTY late at night because that creaky old wooden World War II duplex, it just thundered. I had to put rubber pads underneath the feet of the teletype so the noise didn't transmit through the floor too badly to the other half of the duplex.
Let's talk a little bit about what you were doing in the Navy in terms of how did that go? You started as an electronics technician. How did you end up on submarines?
Well, back in my youth, I made about a dozen poor decisions, and one of them was I got talked into going Navy nuclear power by a civilian who'd been in the Air Force. So anyway, there was no nuclear power rating at the Navy in the time. You were either a machinist or a electrician or an ET, electronics tech, and I was an electronics tech rating. So I went through basic electronics school in San Diego, then up to Treasure Island for ETA school, then had some time off on a minesweeper between classes, and then back up to Mare Island near, Vallejo, California, for nuclear power school. A 6-month school, very intensive. It's all the theory. Quite a few people drop out of it. I made it through okay. Then they give you some hands-on training on a real reactor, and it happens to be in Idaho. There's no naval station there, but they get you a rental home someplace, and then you get bused 90 miles out into the desert to the National Reactor Testing Station. There we took more classes, and the first half was all classroom, and you could quit at 5. The second half, you couldn't take your homework home because it was classified. And the second half, they call them prototypes. They're real operating nuclear power plants, and they just turn a generator or I think ours had a big paddle in a big pool of water. You need something to absorb the power. But it was a real maneuvering room, with room for the electrical operator, the throttleman, and in the middle would be the reactor operator. That was me. Anyway, graduated out of the class, applied for a base on Bremerton on the West Coast, where I grew up, and of course I got stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, opposite coast. About the time I got there, the submarine was going into overhaul at Portsmouth for a year. So I ran back, got married, took my now wife and son up to Maine and spent a year in Maine while the sub was in overhaul.
Were you still in the Navy up in Maine?
Oh, yeah. I was in there for six long years.
If your submarine that you're assigned to is in dry dock, for all intent purposes, what do you do for that year? Are you not part of that restoration?
Oh, we are. The crew members were heavily involved in not only doing a lot of the maintenance, but watching the shipyard workers and making sure they didn't. I mean, there were inspectors all over the place. They take QA very seriously on a nuclear-powered ship. Over the years prior to going overhaul, each division had built up a list of, this has got to be fixed when we go into overhaul. We can't do it ourselves. I mean, there's two big motor generators, DC to AC generators that run off the battery for emergency power. They're in the lower level of the boat. They cut a big hole in the top of the boat and then opened up the middle deck and hauled those two things out because at least one of them had developed a short in some of the windings, and it had to go back to the electric shop on the shipyard to be torn apart and repaired. Those are the sort of things you can't do while it's in the boat. So anyway, we spent the 6 months in overhaul, back to Norfolk, which was Submarine Squadron 6 was our home squadron at the naval base. Spent a few months, sea trials, shakeout, down to the Caribbean for sound trials. They run your boat through a series of underwater microphones, listening for noises. Everything was sound mounted for maximum quiet, minimum noise, and they report the findings. You go back in and repair anything they found. I seem to recall them finding one faulty soundproofing on a generator or something. You could hear sounds travel a long ways underwater.
And now this message from ICOM America. Got cabin fever? ICOM has the rigs that you need to get into the field or to update your ham shack with a variety of base stations, mobiles, and handhelds. ICOM's newest 2-meter amateur FM transceiver is the ICOM IC V3500 or the V3500. This 65-watt transceiver has a compact body and simple interface. Its features include simple operation with a modern white display, instant volume, loud, and mute functions, emergency call and alarm features, and a 4.5-watt audio amplifier for loud and crisp audio. The ICOM ICT-10 is a dual-band VHF-UHF rugged portable that meets or exceeds standard military testing in its IP67 waterproof case. The ICT-10 can withstand any field activities ahead of it. Features include extra loud 1500 milliwatt audio amplified speaker, DTMF front-mounted keypad, 5 watts of output power, 11 hours of operating time, and NOAA weather alerts. The ICOM IC7300 is our favorite high-performance innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed every ham's expectations for an entry-level HF transceiver. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. The IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion. Base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package, covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The IC705 features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts when connected to 13.8 volts DC. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger. Micro SD card slot, and a speaker microphone, the HM243, which is included in the package. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with room for accessories and your lunch. Designed from user input, the ICOM ID5100A is mobile radio innovation taken to the next level. This rig offers an intuitive user touchscreen interface and connects with Android devices and Bluetooth headsets via the optional Bluetooth module. This mobile rig includes up to 50 watts output power, integrated GPS receiver, DV-DV dual watch, DV-FM repeater list function, D+ reflector linking, and SD card slot for voice and data storage. Finally, the ICOM ID52A is a VHF-UHF dual-band portable with D-Star and FM functionality in a beautiful handheld package. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex repeater regional worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet network. The ID52 features include a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display, VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it is IPX7 waterproof. You can share the Android app for D-Star operation, battery pack, and headsets between the ID52A and your IC705. So there you have it. The wide variety of complementary ICOM transceivers to open up the coming spring SOTA, POTA, contests, DXing, and EMS operation. You can find out more about these fine rigs by clicking on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit an ICOM dealer near you to purchase one or all of these rigs, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. If you read Tom Clancy's book, The Hunt for Red October, then you learned all about how sound is important and keeping quiet is very important.
When it's quiet, when there isn't a lot of sea condition, the sonarman can hear the props on a freighter 100 miles away.
So what did you do after the Navy? You have this experience as an electrician on an electric boat. What happened after that?
I went back to work for the telephone company. I had been working for Pacific Telephone. It goes that far back. Summer jobs through college. Before going in the Navy, I went to work for them full time. Well, this was during the Vietnam War, and they told all the companies, when they come back from military duty, you have to give them their job back. So I went back to the same building, different job, same boss. He'd moved up 6 years later, rented a house nearby, which is in my hometown. It was a couple miles from my folks. Really handy because we had a newborn baby. I did Pacific Telephone for about 2 years, and I probably would have stayed there longer. But being the junior man, I got transferred to a central office about, 20 miles away, a freeway commute. It kind of annoyed me. Had a ham friend who was working in a development company building a Telex and Twix central office. Do you even know what those are?
I do. Telex was a very expensive way to communicate with foreign companies, as I recall. You paid by the character.
Yeah, well, this is pre-internet, so it was what we had.
It was before fax.
Yes.
I think fax probably wiped out the telex business.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. And anyway, this was a company developing a very large scalable, like a telephone switch for Twixes and telexes. And none of the engineers there knew anything about the actual physical teletypes. So my buddy said, you know all about these things. We need you to come maintain. So being annoyed at the phone company at the time, I changed jobs and moved into an electronics technician. Took care of all their teletypes for them. Started learning digital electronics and helping an engineer debug. This is back when the circuit boards on this particular thing were, the size of cookie platters. Maybe 11 by 14, something like that. Lots of integrated circuits. Those really hot new TTL circuits. This was in 79, 80. They finished the development and offered me a job back at the plant, helping with them in Fredericksburg, Maryland. I had gone back there to help them develop the first one. And after scraping ice off the windshield with a credit card of my rental car, I said, no, I'm not going to move to the East Coast. I had I hadn't seriously considered it anyway.
What was the company name?
Actually, Plantronics.
Oh, really? Okay. Are you wearing a Plantronics headset right now?
No, I switched from Plantronics a few years ago. Telex and Twix switching system was a wing of Plantronics back then. I suspect it was actually called Frederick Electronics out of Fredericksburg, Maryland. Boy, this is going way back. So anyway, they folded up the development when they were done, and I was the last one there. I waved goodbye to the 18-wheeler that we'd loaded up with gear and turned off the lights, locked the door, and gave the keys back to the landlord. I worked for a couple small startups in between. Then I went to work for a company called MyCom. Mini computers were hot then.
In Simi Valley?
Yes. It was originally in San Fernando Valley, and I was commuting over there from Simi Valley, where I had moved in 79. It was about a 18-mile commute up and over the hill and down, and not horrible. I really enjoyed working there, learned a lot, and they were growing like crazy. The products that they made, multiplexers, serial line multiplexers, were selling like hotcakes because mini computers were the thing back then. And I mentioned one time to the facilities manager, there's a large electronics plant in Simi that's up for sale. It was a manufacturer of memory chips, had built a building in Simi, but then about the time they started putting people in it, they moved all their production offshore. So it was vacant. So I mentioned this to the manager, and he kind of poo-pooed it. Well, 18 months later, I was moving my department in there, and we had 2 buildings there and grew like crazy, selling stuff like crazy, and we were very into voice over, digital voice, but it wasn't voice over IP then. It was voice over frame relay, which was sort of like T1, only a little slower. But we had some very good voice technology, and we got bought by Nortel. Northern Telecom became Nortel. They had a whole big line of switches. They were doing great. They built us a new building in Simi, and we moved in there for a couple years. Sadly, Nortel was a pioneer in the dot-com crash. Prior to them laying everybody off, they had outsourced all their IT to Computer Science Corporation. So I was a contractor working in the building. And once again, I was pretty much the last one to leave. We shipped all the gear out to the other Nortel sites. Nortel spiraled into oblivion after that. The only company I know who bought a sales and marketing company for $1.2 billion and sell it 2 years later for $0.2 billion.
No, I remember I was really into PBXs and switches in those days, and Nortel was a big maker of...
The Meridian.
Yeah, right.
The Meridian, yeah.
Which was a small business switch, right?
They had various sizes. They did have bigger ones, yeah.
For enterprises.
They wanted to take our voice over frame relay technology onto a board to plug into their PBXs.
Oh, interesting. I saw these companies come and go. It was actually quite amazing at the time. I was a test equipment salesman out there in the west end of the valley when MyCom was doing their thing. So I kind of remember the changes that were happening. The valley was a really happening place in the early 80s for electronics.
For electronics, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Tandem Computer, I think, was out there. And
Tandem, the early disk drive manufacturers were there, early tape drive manufacturers.
That's right. There was a number of Micropolis, I think, was one of them, right?
Micropolis, yes. I think I had one of their drives in my first home computer.
I think what was happening out there, or you'd have a company like Micropolis or Tandem or something like that, and their chief engineers would get pissed off about something, and then they would go across the street and start up a rival. And that's why all of a sudden you had, in the West Valley, 6 companies making hard drives.
Yes, and actually the engineer who founded MyCom was at a previous company that had kind of gone bankrupt. And he says, I'm going to form my company. So it was MyCom, but he did MICOM. It was a company that built lease line modems. And their hottest, newest product was their 4800 bit per second modem, 4800 baud. And it was like a rack of those same cookie sheet sized cards. Modems were big back then.
That was a very exciting time. And you're right, it all kind of seemed to ship offshore, but it was a very exciting time for entrepreneurism. There was a lot of money, flowing into these companies.
There was.
Everybody wanted to be a disk drive maker or a PC maker or something like that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I stayed with MyCom. I went to work for them in 81. We got bought by Nortel in 96. I got shipped down the river to CSC in 2000. I stayed with CSC about a year and a half. Didn't like it at all. I happened to be at a party one time in Simi Valley, and some people there were there that I knew, and one of them was the director of radiology from the local hospital. And I mentioned I was kind of looking around for a job. And she says, we need an IT manager. Put your resume in. Okay, that's 1.5 miles from home. I'm up with that. So I did, and I didn't hear anything. And I happened to mention it to her a month or so later. She said, let me make a phone call. So she was having lunch with the president of the hospital. She mentioned that. And they encouraged the IT management to interview me again. And I did get the job. So I worked as the IT director for Simi Valley Hospital for 7 years. Yeah, 7 years. That ended. I will confess, I'm pretty good with electronics and communications. I got pretty good at managing people. The directors of the department loved me, but I apparently got an F in hospital politics.
I've been there and done that, I can tell you. It's very political. It's a very political environment.
Yes. Early on in my career with MyCom, I'd moved into management. And honestly, I was terrible the first couple of years. Then it was just bad. Then it was mediocre. Towards the end, I got pretty good. So I was a pretty good IT director, budgets and all that. But I'd been messing around with Linux since the early 90s. I'd gotten pretty good at it.
Personally? I mean, at home as a hobby?
Yeah. I got it. Well, let's rewind a little bit. Back when I was doing packet radio, there was a guy who was writing sort of a BBS for packet radio. It was called TNOS, T-N-O-S. Brian, I forget his name. This was back in the early days of the internet, pre-web. You were on an email mailing list. If you wanted software, you went to an FTP site. So anyway, his software was quite good, and he had a lot of users. He kept adding features. He'd bring out a new version every week, and it got to be a router, and it handled TCP/IP and auto forwarding and stuff like that. The program got up to the size where it wouldn't compile properly with his C compiler, and I think it was Borland Pascal or Borland C. So he opened up a ticket with them, and they asked him to see the code. And he said, sure, it's not anything. So they sent it off to him and said, this is the most complicated code we've ever seen. We can't help you. So I thought, well, hell, what am I going to do? So there was a C compiler called GCC under Linux, and he tried that, and it compiled nicely. So he moved over to Linux, and a substantial fraction of his users followed him, and I was one of them. Now, I didn't know squat all about Linux then. Never did a GUI. It was a terminal. I only ran in root. But, it did everything I needed on an old 386, multitasking and everything, and I was impressed. So I started playing with Linux on the desktop on a junker after that, and got to the point where it would load a GUI, and I thought, this could be a full-time desktop. It's quite good. And I've been there. I think I dumped my last Windows machine in 2007, something like that.
You're a little bit older than me, so that means you're no longer in IT.
I'm retired now.
I still have to own Windows computers because I have clients that use them, but I'm using Kubuntu, KD Plasma on Ubuntu.
Same here.
No, I love it.
Migrated my wife over, yeah.
It just works.
Oh, it does. I had been using Fedora Linux for many, many years, and I started deploying Raspberry Pis at some of my radio sites. Well, it's Debian-based. I probably should move over to something Debian-based. And I used KDE since 1.0, back in the early days. So you use what you're used to, and yeah, it just works.
It just works. You don't have to reboot it every day, although I reboot it every once in a while just to make me feel I'm better at it. So you touched on something that I wanted to talk about. You had a stint where you were really into packet radio, and it's my understanding that you were involved in a packet radio network in California?
Yeah.
That I didn't know about. Seems like I should have known. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Obviously 1200 baud, 2 meters, yada, 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 all on the same frequency. Got to love that hidden terminal problem. Ugh, terrible. So we started contemplating a backbone, and we were using NetROM. NetROM was an early routing protocol you could put in a TNC. And as they found bugs in it, they worked it out and fixed it and provided upgrades. But the unique thing about that was you could bridge a few TNCs with some judicious diode steering, and you could build a multi-TNC router. So at that point in time, the K9NG 9600 baud modems were coming out, and we had a bunch of 13509 220 radios. We had them all crystalled up for the bottom of 220 with 9600 baud radios on them, and they were moving. You'd come in on 1200, go back, come out on 220 at 9600 across the link, and come back out to the end user on 1200. That's how you do things. You build cells. Just getting ready to deploy them when the FCC pulled the bottom two megahertz of 220 away from us. and gave it to UPS, who has yet to use it to this day. So they, well, what are we going to do? Well, a friend of mine was into VHF radios, and he had a bunch of 6-meter radios, old giant Motorola Micors.
Micors, yeah. Mocom 70s?
Yes, thank you. Big, 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 big.
Heavy trunk mount.
Yeah, but rugged as hell. So we thought, well, let's run the 96 baud modems through them and see what happens. Well, they wouldn't pass data. Took a look at it, and the data coming out of discriminator looked like CW. It didn't have enough bandwidth for 9600. Well, we looked into modifying the radios to widen the bandwidth. Thought, the heck with it. So I jumper cut the K9NG modems and dialed them down to 4800, and they passed data flawlessly over long distances. So we put the word out, and I think eventually, let's see, the westernmost end was San Ynez Peak.
Which is Santa Barbara.
Yeah. To Mount Disappointment.
Middle of L.A.
Potosi.
Las Vegas.
Yes. And I did not manage that one, and it went beyond there to Phoenix and Tucson.
And were these reliable links?
Yes.
Could you actually move packet messages from, say, Phoenix to Vegas and Phoenix to Los Angeles?
I know they did. About the time that was established, I got out of packet radio. Let's just say Southern California packet politics. Fighting over channels. It kind of turned me off to it and burned out. So anyway, I'd been doing it since 85, and that was 96 or something like that. So I was QRT for a few years. I'm only doing packet radio now because I have to. But in between, I was QRT for a few years, then got into HF digital, Pactor, then PSK31. I did a lot of PSK31.
What did you like about Pactor? And Pactor seems very esoteric.
It is, and I honestly only dabbled with it a little bit. PSK31 was a lot more like RTTY. You transmit, you receive, transmit, receive. I had some wonderful memories from radio teletype. I did it for a dozen years, but I'd moved on. But PSK31 was great for rag chewing, which I liked to do. Don't do much of it anymore, except things like this. Did PSK31 for quite a while, or assorted. I tend to do things for a long time, the same mode, and then I change modes. It's not like I do sideband in the morning and CW in the evening or something like that. But anyway, got kind of interested in the whole AREDN thing in 2014.
Okay, so we have to back up then.
Yeah.
You got involved in AREDN, so now you have to tell us what AREDN is. For those people that don't know what AREDN is, if anybody Googles Orv and your call sign, you're going to see hundreds of listings of Orv talking about AREDN. So I'm just setting this up for you so you can tee it off. What is AREDN?
AREDN is the successor to Broadband Hamnet. They actually kicked it off, Broadband Hamnet, BBHN. They were doing something very similar, but they were basing it on the old Linksys WRT54G.
That was a home router.
It was a home router, but it was running Linux. Let me rewind a little bit here. Back when Linux was really the hot thing in the late 90s, Linksys said, that's a free operating system. We could run our hardware on that. And so they did. The Linksys WRT54G runs Linux.
And it had a 2 gigahertz Wi-Fi.
Yes, only 2.4, 802.11b and G, no 802.11n. And being open source, anybody could look at it, and a group said we could do better than that. So they grabbed the Linksys Linux software and made their own projects out of it. OpenWRT, DDWRT, Tomato, and I'm sure there's others, are third-party open source software you can load on your home router or wireless access point. And they support many, many, many different products and models. Actually, I think I'm running OpenWRT on mine now, my home router. So when Broadband Hamnet started thinking about it, we could make a ham radio IP network out of this. So they took OpenWRT code, which again is open source, and made Broadband Hamnet. Claim to fame was it ran something called OLSR, Open Link State Routing or some such. I never can remember. But the point is it does routing broadcasts and does self-discovery of routes. With that, you could build an IP network. And they did that.
On amateur radio frequencies, because we have, the lower part of 2.4 gigahertz, right?
But theirs was not capable of Part 97 operation yet. Broadband Hamnet never had that. That's because Broadband Hamnet focused on that Linksys WRT 54G. After a number of years, a couple of the developers wanted to migrate to other hardware. And the Broadband Hamnet group said, no, we want to maintain our support group. Well, being open source, they took their ball and went home and made AREDN. And the first one they ported to was the Ubiquity Bullet M2. Still 2.4 gigahertz, but more RAM and more ROM. You could do more flash memory. Then it went to the Ubiquity 5 gig and some other stuff, and then turns out that whatever OpenWRT supports that makes sense, AREDN can support. They add their special sauce to it, and poof, it becomes an AREDN platform, Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network, because their initial focus was something you could deploy easily in an emergency. They wanted to make it easy to deploy for a ham who didn't know a lot about networks. So it's got a built-in DNS server, domain name server, built-in DHCP server.
What does DNS do for people that don't know?
DNS is a name server. If you say, I want to connect to google.com, the computer has no idea what google.com. It says, what IP address is it? The domain name server that serves your computer will say, google.com is at 20.5.2.10, and your computer will say, thanks very much, and put out a connect request out to the network to that IP address.
So it's like the 411 information for the internet.
It's a host name to IP address translator, which means what IP address are you going to put on it? How do you coordinate IP addresses? So what AREDN did, they came up with an algorithm that takes the MAC address of the Ethernet port. The media access control number is a 32-bit hex number that is supposed to be unique to that piece of hardware.
In the world.
In the world. The upper three octets, are assigned to a given manufacturer, and they're free to do what they want with the bottom three. Yeah. So anyway, that was unique to every Ubiquity device, every TP-Link, whatever, and they came up with an algorithm that generated a unique IP address based on the MAC address. That way, the ham didn't have to worry about assigning IP addresses. Already done. And that assures that there would be no conflict between a ham running AREDN in one town and a ham in an adjacent town assigning the same IP address just because it was easy.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Now, you wouldn't think that's a problem when you're setting up a network, but at least that's actually very clever.
Yes, that's why IP addresses are controlled very carefully by organizations. Duplicate IP addresses are bad news. So anyway, that solved the problem of the ham getting set up with his AREDN networking of assigning IP addresses, but you can't just have the AREDN box. You've got to connect something to it, like a computer, so you can talk to it. Well, that computer needs a similar IP address. So the DHCP server, Dynamic Host Control Protocol, running in the AREDN box has a little pool of adjacent IP addresses that it hands out to devices that need them, like a VoIP telephone, a Raspberry Pi, your computer, whatever. So you've got that little pool of IP addresses. So you just plug it in and you're connected. You don't have to worry about assigning an IP address to each and everything you want to put on the network. Makes it much simpler when you're out in the field. You just plug stuff in and go.
Right, so it's on your side of the network, and AREDN is the WAN side of the network. Your router will have a WAN connection, usually only one, if it's a home router. And then the LAN side is you, right?
Right. And then, like, for instance, on a MikroTik HAP AC Lite, which running AREDN on it would go in your shack, and it coordinates all this stuff. And one of its ports will go to your outside node, the one up on your roof that communicates with the actual RF network. And those two talk a protocol called DTD, device to device. And that's how they intercommunicate routing information and stuff like that. So the typical HAP AC light has 5 ports. One goes to your home WAN, port 1. Port 5 goes up to the roof node and also supplies PoE power to it, by the way, making things simpler. And the 3 in the middle are for your use in your home shack. And if you're like me, very quickly one of those ports goes to another switch where you can plug more things in.
Right. I was just thinking about that if you have a lot of devices, my office here has about 16 devices plugged into a switch under the desk. I saw a picture of your desk.
Good thing this is not a video feed. That's embarrassing.
I thought that was interesting.
So those who are just listening to this, I have a couple of pictures of my operating station on my QRZ site. One's to the front, and obviously I've cleaned it up nice. A couple of shelves of radios, a couple of monitor screens, a keyboard, nice stuff. You go around in the back, and when you have 2 or 3 servers, 2 or 3 switches, 2 or 3 power supplies, it gets messy. Even with the cable management I've got installed there, I have to go in and titivate things, clean them up every quarter or so. Where did this cable come from?
I was sitting there looking at that picture as I'm preparing for this episode, and I'm thinking, well, you know what? If it was me, I would probably plug everything in and then cable lace it. And then I'm thinking, no, that would be stupid because as soon as I got finished, I would have to change something, right? So you're always patching and reporting because all of a sudden your needs change. And so it's almost impossible to have it look like the military back there.
Yeah, not going to happen. So I ran J-hooks along the back of the desk, and I think that helps a lot.
What I liked was the lower shelf that you've got stuff sitting on with the ports facing you.
Yeah, you have to.
If you're plugging things in, then you can actually get to those things. And you leave a few feet behind your desk in order to get in there and do some work.
Yeah, when I originally put my shack in there, and it's part of the converted garage, it was, like 6 inches away from the back wall. And that's not going to happen, especially as I got older. So when I rebuilt the work operating station, I pulled it out a couple feet. So I can get down there and get to the get to the stuff on the lower shelf. There's radios under there. The NAS, the network attached storage for the house, is under there. There's a UPS, a big honking AGM battery for backup. It goes on and on.
Let's go back to AREDN. How big is the network? On your QRZ page, you talk about the network that's kind of in the north end of the valley, Simi Valley, all the way up to Santa Barbara. But I understand that AREDN now extends most of Southern California?
It does.
Does your network join to the larger network?
Yes. If they hear each other, they know about each other. The routing table just keeps growing. There are software mappers, network crawlers, that will go out and map the network. And if they've put the latitude and longitude into the node, they can place it on a map. And let me look real quick, just here, see what our node count is at this very moment. And quit out of this. It says 508 nodes that the mapper can find. Now, obviously, the RF link distance is limited, right? Limited line of sight, and 600 milliwatts only goes so far. So we do a lot of tunneling. The AREDN software has provisions to make either a tunnel server or a tunnel client. And if you happen to get interested in AREDN, you can, and there's no RF link anywhere, you're in a network black hole, you can tunnel into an adjacent node that does have network connectivity, and you can see the network, and you can use that until such time as the network does come out and get to a point where you have an RF link.
So when you say tunneling, you're meaning that you're actually going to go through your internet connection from your internet supplier to, it's like a black hole. You're entering the black hole of the commercial internet and coming out into an AREDN router.
Right.
That puts you up onto the AREDN network.
Yes, and AREDN itself runs a global tunnel server, typically links countries together, or somebody gets up in a remote area in, Iceland. obviously they're not going to have too much RF connectivity. They can tunnel in and participate in activities and see the resources and servers that are out on the network.
Okay, so I find this to be very interesting for a number of reasons. And one of those things I'm thinking about is that if we're trying to find younger people in amateur radio or attract them to amateur radio, obviously the same things that attracted you and me 50, 60 years ago to ham radio are not those things that attract younger people now. But networking and being able to plug game servers or telephone servers or any kind of devices, cameras, whatever, into a private network, a network of other enthusiasts. What have you found from your experience in terms of the kind of users that you're attracting? And are those users perhaps coming from the targets that we want in order to continue to build the amateur radio hobby and its participants?
I've personally seen that. Again, rewind. Back when Linux was hot, our local Linux users group decided we should put on a show. Sounds like a musical. But anyway, the Southern California Linux Expo came into existence 20 years ago. We're still running it. Hundreds of booths, tons of speakers, SoCalLinuxExpo.org. And over the last 5 years, the AREDN team has had, we were running a ham radio and Linux speaker track for a couple years, not doing that now, but AREDN has had a booth on the expo floor for the past 4 or 5 years. And every year we find that, we know half a dozen and a dozen geeks who come by end up getting into the hobby because of AREDN. They want to do digital networking. And AREDN's newest and most competent, most busiest, most active coder, Tim, KN6PLV, was a software engineer, a developer up in Berkeley, California. He got interested in AREDN networking sometime in early 21. So he got his license in June of 21, contributed his first major patch to AREDN in October of 20, and it substantially stabilized the network. And he's been grinding out improved code ever since. The other developers still contribute too, but I think they're happy to have somebody, jump in there and so they can relax a little bit. But he's made a lot of improvement to the code. And he's one of those who got attracted to it because it was digital ham radio.
One of the criticisms that I've heard of AREDN in terms of its self-healing packet, whatever, you can't run AREDN between mountaintop nodes. In order to have the traffic throughput, you actually are linking major nodes together, not using AREDN. Is that true?
It is. AREDN was designed to be easy to use, and as a result, let me put it this way. If you have 2 laptops on your home network, they can't talk to each other directly. They have to go through your wireless access point. It's because they've got this, I know it's not politically correct anymore, but master-slave relationship. Obviously, you can't make a real mesh network that way. So the AREDN code runs in ad hoc mode, and that's less efficient than some of the other faster modes of wireless networking. So they did sacrifice some throughput for connectivity.
And ease of use.
Yeah. Now, when you say less throughput, I've got a 4.5 mile link to the hilltop that gives me network access. It's got a sector antenna up there, and I have a dish up high enough on my tower where I have line of sight. Both ends were been in place for a long time or were starting to fail. So I replaced the old Rocket up on the sector antenna with a Rocket 5 AC running 802.11 AC, and my flaky power beam on the tower I replaced with a nano beam running AC. And before that, I was getting just point-to-point throughput about 14 to 15 megabits per second. After I swapped both ends, I was getting 18 to 19 one way and 29 to 30 the other way. So even using AREDN, upgrading to 802.11 AC, I think will give them a lot of improvement in throughput. But that is true that mountaintop to mountaintop, we do use transport because you have a user access point running AREDN on a hilltop. You don't need to run AREDN to move it to the other mountaintop. So using 5 gigs primarily for that, still some 3 gigs, playing with 10 gigs, and I can't say any more about that right now, but that's very encouraging. So yeah, AREDN is not meant for long haul. I will come out right out and say that.
Between two AREDN sites, what's the longest path?
Between two AREDN sites, I think I saw a 55-mile link.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, that being said, the farther you go, the slower it goes. ANCAC and all that stuff. So you're better with multiple hops if you can. The 10 gig stuff we're playing with, I shouldn't say that, is equally competent with high throughputs. Let's put it that way.
And are you trying to make a self-healing network so you're actually doing loops?
Well, here's the deal. It's a dirty little secret. The OLSR version 1 protocol was never written with this sort of stuff in mind. It was written for, wireless, mobile or short haul. And the developers of it deprecated it and went to OLSR v2, which isn't backwards compatible. And after a while, they deprecated that. They're working on something called Batman, which is also not backwards compatible. And we proved definitively that the AREDN code couldn't handle loops, routing loop. It was sensitive to route flapping, which is a known, industry problem. Route flapping. You flop back and forth between two routes. How do you manage it? Tim, the developer, has put 2 or 3 patches in there to where it's much less susceptible now. You can have 2 links up running from one point to another through different routes, and it will not fall on its face. Let's just leave it at that. It's improved substantially. But no, we use the hub and spoke method rather than mesh down here. Others, every situation's different, but it's quite reliable.
You also have the advantage of hills. I mean, not just hills, but of 3,000-foot or 5,000-foot hills.
Yes, courtesy of all the earthquake faults. Yes, we have lots of hills and valleys and not a lot of trees. Other places, line of sight is much more difficult to achieve. There's no doubt.
So then you're using more mesh. If you're like Kansas City, for example, and you're running AREDN, you'd probably be using more mesh between the nodes.
You could. Certainly you want redundant paths if you can make them work. Of course, that involves more equipment, more money, more sites. But yeah, obviously.
I guess that was the promise of Hamnet, that if you had a whole bunch of users, you would use the other users as a way to propagate your signal across, kind of like Packet.
Yeah, you can. But remember, every hop you take increases your latency.
Right. So if you're trying to run video across a link, then...
Yeah, and not going to happen. We do find across our network, which is a mix of AREDN and backbone across the county, I can usually maintain 5 megabits per second end-to-end, which is not bad for 720p video. Matter of fact, we run a weekly Team Talk net, and it'll handle video. Once in a while, I'll have all the guys fire up their cameras, and we've put 7 streams across there. Now, the little thumbnails are 640 by 480 at about 10 frames per second, but it handles it just fine.
Have you integrated the AREDN network with your county EMS services or hospitals or anything like that? Is this a great network for emergencies? It
could be. We're working on that. It's slow going. It's frequently hard to get any kind of amateur radio equipment into a served agency or an agency that we would like to serve. Locally here, we do have it in the local police department, EOC, and the hospital. They have a network connection, they have Team Talk, and they have a VoIP telephone with an extension off the local PBX. Farther west into the county, it's been tough slogging. The pandemic didn't help either. But we have money budgeted for all of them from an ARDC grant, so when we get the opportunity, we'll drop an RF link in there and give them the stuff. Now, the local ham emergency communications group, ACS, hasn't been a lot of the members have mesh connectivity, but it's not incorporated into drills specifically. Let's put it that way. Local ham likes to go out and stream video from aid stations at local marathons and races and events, and we did that successfully with the Ventura Marathon a couple weekends ago. I took his video stream, put it into OBS, and streamed it to a Zoom session that was running in the control trailer. That was fun. It worked fairly well. Lessons learned.
OBS is a software that's on Linux.
Open Broadcasting Service System, OBS.
OBS. I'm trying to think of a Windows equivalent to it.
I think it's supported on Windows, but yeah.
Like Adobe Premiere. OBS is kind of like Adobe Premiere.
It lets you integrate stuff on the screen and present it. your face, a graph, a video, whatever.
It's production, not post-production.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah, that's a good description. We've had a couple in the last 4 years, almost 5 now. We've had 2 really large brush fires come through here. Southern California is really susceptible to the hot, dry, windy conditions. And of course, the brush burns very nicely when it's very dry. The first one was the Thomas fire in 2017. Yeah, 2017. And then the Woolsey fire, Woolsey fire in 2018. And here, let me rewind. In late 2016 and all through 2017, the AREDN code had gained the capability to actually build network. And another ham and I, Paul WD6BI, were building a backbone across the county, hop to hop to hop. And at one site on Sulphur Mountain near Ojai, we threw up a junker camera just for grins. In September of 2017, Ben, AI6YR, he's a tech specialist here in the area, sent me an email with a link to an article explaining how to stream video cameras, webcams, to YouTube. He said, see if you can figure this out. We might use it someday. Well, I messed around with it and showed him a YouTube stream of my driveway camera. Whoop-de-doo. But it worked, and I filed it away. Well, 6 weeks later, the Thomas fire breaks out near Santa Paula, California. He pinged me and said, don't you have a camera up there? Well, yeah, different brand of camera, different model. There's a computer up there, but it's running Windows, not Linux. But I got it figured out in relatively good order. And we streamed the fire coming up over the hill out to YouTube for not quite 2 hours until we lost power at an intermediate site. We didn't have any backup power at that time. Well, after we lost power, the fire continued west, just missed the property the tower was on, and went west and just totally ravaged the town of Ventura. Hundreds of structures. About 3 or 4 days later, I got an email from a fire inspector from the local Ventura County Fire Department wanting the URL of the YouTube video. It was still up there, so I gave it to him, and he thanked me. Never heard anything back directly, but we did hear indirectly that they found it useful because of the first existing video of the fire. And every year in June, the local County Board of Supervisors declares June Ham Radio Day because of, Field Day. Well, that following year in 2018, the proclamation specifically mentioned that video. So we got some good PR out of it. Plus, we learned quite a few lessons. After that, we spent time, better cameras, pan-tilt zoom cameras where we could, more sites where we could, battery backup and or solar where we could. So 11 months later, the Woolsey fire breaks out right on the border between LA and Ventura County. Again, a hot, windy, dry day, just howling winds. And my son and I actually saw the fire break out on the hills to the south of us, and it just took off. So I started streaming video as it ran across the hills to the south of our town, and I was streaming it via a new pan-tilt zoom camera on the north edge of town, streaming it out to YouTube. And Ben, AI6YR, has a huge following because he's very big on emergency communications and putting out information, and he put the URL out there. And over the next 36 hours or so that I streamed it, off and on, the user count went up and down from several hundred. And we heard that people mentioned that it was a good source of real-time information. So we were very big on streaming video to YouTube here when needed. There have been a couple smaller brush fires I've streamed since then, and we need to get more cameras out. But that's something that people haven't appreciated, that frequently, there are a lot of hilltop cameras. A lot of them are county, state, whatever, especially in California. But frequently ham radio installations are on sites that don't have any commercial or governmental presence. So we could have a unique view of an incident. And that's what we found in actually both of these. And that's why I encourage people, if you have an AREDN site, put a camera on it.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Most of the pictures I see of AREDN sites have cameras on them. They're not necessarily pan, tilt, zoom, PTZ cameras. They look like they're maybe fixed at something. Are those cameras designed to perhaps persuade people not to approach the site?
Well, what we've taken to do is putting a second site camera looking right down at the entrance. Those aren't expensive. The little pointed cameras, we're buying for about $80 a piece, and they're excellent cameras. Winlink, folks, excellent cameras.
Do they actually have a deterrent effect?
I haven't seen anybody on them yet. Obviously, if you can't monitor them 24/7, so the newest cameras have a spot for a micro SD card, and they will record motion themselves according to the parameters you set. And we're putting those SD cards in every camera we put up now. Got to record snow on Chatsworth Peak the other day when it was so cold and windy and snowy in Southern California. It was crazy.
What's the current rig now?
For AREDN?
Just in general. You have a tower in your yard?
I do. It went up in 1981, blew down in 82, put it up taller in 82. It's been up ever since. Much stronger. We had huge winds that day. I tell people, it's bolted to the eaves of the second floor, and I tell people it held up the house during the 94 quake. Anyway, used to have a tri-bander at the top. It broke. I took it down, fixed it, but then my knees faded out. What it has now on it is a 40-meter delta loop that I can transmit 40, 20, 15, and 10, which is fortuitous because in the shack, my shack runs Winlink 24/7. I run Winlink Express, Packet Relay, RMS Tri-Mode, and HF rig scans for incoming connections on 40 and 20. I also got an 80-meter shortened inverted V in the back, and it scans that too.
So you're a service provider.
I am.
You're a Winlink service provider.
Yeah, I guess. Old TS480, but it's controlled by RMS Tri-Mode. It scans periodically every 6 seconds. I'm amazed at the amount of incoming traffic it gets, which is switched. If I have an internet connection active, it will accept and forward on out to the internet.
You're not a rag chewer. You're not on CW. You're supplying services. I mean, I understand this. I spend more time in my shop than I do on the air.
I do rag chew a lot, but it's not by voice. It's digital. Keyboard. We have a Mattermost server on the mesh network, and all the mesh guys. It's like Slack, but it's open source. I've got, let me see. Well, not all of these are radio-based, but on my second screen here, top to bottom, I have Telegram, I have Slack, I have Discord, and I have Mattermost all running.
All through the AREDN network?
No, only one of them is. But I can't, well, obviously, if they're not on the AREDN network, I can't talk to them. I do a lot of coordination and mentoring through those social media channels. I get anywhere from 0 to 3 or 4 emails a day, a couple phone calls, ad hoc stuff through all the social media stuff. I monitor the Facebook AREDN forum.
You're employed almost full-time by AREDN.
It's a good thing I retired.
Well, I just want to also point out that you wrote a beginner's guide to AREDN, which I'll put the link up unless you've revised it.
What version is it? Do you know? Should be in the footer.
Version 19?
That's current.
Okay, so that's the link I'll put up into the show notes page for someone that it's called the AREDN Network Beginner's Guide for the Absolute Newbie.
Yes, and just as a disclaimer, I wrote that as an AREDN user, not a member of the AREDN team. They wanted me. That's why the TM is after the AREDN trademark.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it as well. Okay, that's the rig. So you have a TS480 that's connected to a lot of software and a computer.
Also, RMS Packet has a 1200 baud packet for incoming. It has VARA FM on it for local connections, and it also will forward stuff to another post office over the AREDN network. So I've got 2-meter VHF, VARA FM, and packet. I've got the AREDN network, and I've got HF.
And what is VARA FM?
Oh, you don't know about VARA FM?
We're all going to learn something new.
A Spanish ham wrote up a software modem. Everybody knows about software modems. There's Direwolf and I don't know what else for packet. But Jose, I think his name is, wrote a software modem that uses OFDM, orthogonal frequency division modulation. Yeah. which oddly enough is the same modulation technique AREDN uses, but at a much higher rate. Anyway, VARA FM lets you put multiple carriers in your audio bandwidth, and it tests them back and forth to find out which ones are usable and gets a lot more data through than Packet. Let me see.
Oh, that's called VARA, V-A-R-A, right?
V-A-R-A. And there's two versions for it, for VARA FM and VARA HF, and I use both of those. Over HF, you can get 5 to 6 kilobits per second, I think. I've never looked at it. And with the right gear on VHF and UHF, radios with wide enough bandwidths, you can get up to 25 kilobits per second. It's taking over from Packet.
Which is very respectful for messaging.
Oh, yeah. For VARA, Winlink puts a kind of a limit on the size of attachments, obviously because you would be a weak transferring a medium-sized image over HF. I will tell you that currently in the last couple of weeks on the AREDN network here in Ventura County, we've set up a real live email system over mesh, a real live SMTP server using Thunderbird clients. It's even got a web-based interface, and I've got some beta users testing it, and we'll put it out to the local community. It's just vanilla Linux email server, but it's running on the mesh network. You have to make some tweaks because most of the code is configured like I'm going to be on the internet, and we have to go, no, you're running on a closed network, and here's your parameters. But it's not hard, and no attachment size limit. Well, I think he said the default's 10 megabytes. So obviously you can move a lot of data a lot faster that way. The other small knock I have against Winlink, in order to send point-to-point, you have to have both stations set up for it. In other words, you have to configure the receiving station has to be ready to receive it in point-to-point, and then you transmit. But most people aren't normally sitting there on point-to-point. They're setting up to receive inbound Winlink messages. I think this is going to have a lot of potential as another tool for emergency communications throughout the county and the section. Did that make sense?
I think it does. It's painting a lot of pictures, and I'm writing a lot of terms here for the listeners on your show notes page, because I think that some of the stuff I know, some of the stuff I've heard of, but I don't know a lot about. It's a chance to learn something new, and it's a different side of ham radio. But, ham radio is now, I tell people the ham radio is like the old circuses. We have our 3 rings in the center of the big tent, but we have this midway of 1,000 tents now where all this interesting stuff is happening. So, and this is just one of those things.
That is so true. When I got my novice license, you had a choice of CW or AM. After I'd had my ticket for about a year or so, the sideband versus AM wars started up. And I'm happy to say I was not part of that.
I missed those. I didn't come in until 73.
I tell people you could have 12 hams in a room, and not one of them would be doing the same thing with ham radio as any of the others.
I had some visitors to the shack yesterday. Somebody who said, ham radio, do people still do that? I haven't heard about ham radio in 50 years. And I said, well, ham radio is such a diverse hobby now that no matter what we do, if we're grinding on the bench or we're configuring AREDN, I didn't say that, but I'm thinking it now, we're making so many contributions to technology just through the tinkering that we're doing.
Yes.
And we're sharing it at the speed of light on the internet. You're, making these presentations on YouTube, or someone writing a white paper and putting it up on a blog. It's just amazing how we're iterating faster and faster in terms of fine-tuning and perfecting the technologies that we're doing, and then that always spills over into some new idea, new technology.
Yeah, they take something and use it in a manner that hadn't been thought of.
Right. Let me ask you, what excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio?
I can tell you what I worry about the most.
Okay, so what are you worried about the most in ham radio?
The attitude in the FCC that ham radio isn't worth supporting anymore, and the bandwidth is worth more selling for cash.
Certainly that's true up in the microwave bands. Do you see the HF bands also being threatened this way?
No, anything below 100 megs isn't considered worthwhile.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, because it won't pass large amounts of digital data. They've taken away, I think, half of the 3 gigahertz band now, and the other half is threatened. 5 gigs, they've made some changes that has made it more challenging to run AREDN on, and one of the vendors is still after the ham portion of 10 gigs. So we need to start populating them.
Yeah, so what is your remedy for this, Orv?
We're getting ready to show how you can effectively use 10 gig for high-speed data transfer everywhere. And I can't say any more than that because we're still in a beta test.
Are there enough AREDN users in Southern California to warrant the bandwidth, the spectrum that they're using for this? I mean, how do we make a demonstration to the FCC that our use of the spectrum is worthwhile? It seems to me we could make that argument just from the technology development, the output that comes from that. But do we do a very good job of demonstrating this kind of expertise that develops here?
I'm not sure. I do know in Southern California we have a number of groups that when they do some sort of public demonstration, field day, emergency exercises, the ARES group in eastern Los Angeles County is very active in emergency coordination. They have a presence at every hospital, and they use AREDN in every hospital. So at least all the served agencies over there are very aware of it.
That's not a country of 360 million people. And
it is not. And matter of fact, I suspect there are probably a dozen states in the United States where you could count the number of AREDN users on one hand. I don't know.
And they're using the black hole?
Unfortunately, yes. Well, you have to. We're fortunate here in Southern California that we have lots of these really, really tall towers called mountains. Other places a little more challenging. But it is definitely useful for, like I said, video, emergency phones. Team Talk would be excellent for backup communications from a fire camp to a main zone, because you just nail up a connection and you come up and start talking and it comes out the other end.
Right. So Team Talk is a voice over IP connection over.
It's a voice and video chat server.
You can host it on a Raspberry Pi?
Yes. It runs very nicely on a 3 because it is not CPU or bandwidth intensive.
It's mediating essentially the client does the work and it just mediates the call. So like our Nortel switch, right? Or like our Telex switch.
It brings up one stream and passes that out to the other connections. And by the way, a voice chat is like maximum 30 kilobits per second. It's nothing for an AREDN network. You couldn't do it on packet, but you can do it on AREDN easily. Video too.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
This specific sub-hobby, you mean?
No, I'm saying you're running into somebody like you. They've taken a break for 30 years from the hobby. They're thinking about something that they would do in their retirement. Or you've run into somebody who has an interest in picking up a hobby, although hobbies seem to be kind of waning right now in most places because people seem to be overwhelmed with other things. But you have a new ham and you have a ham that's thinking about coming back. What advice would you give them in terms of how to find success?
Well, obviously, join your local club. Clubs are as varied as, I don't know what, snowflakes. But certainly you can find somebody to at least answer your questions. Some clubs are very welcoming. Some are less so. Depends on the makeup. Read.
There's no shortage of bad stuff as well as good stuff on the internet.
Yeah, that's true too. I've been subscribed. I've been belonging to the ARRL like forever. I'm not a life member. I should have joined early on.
It might have been cheaper over all the years, right?
Yes. Oh, I know it would have. I could have probably become a life member back then for the cost of 1 year's subscription now. The QST is a good magazine, and you also get QEX, which is their very technical journal. It's fun reading. I tell people, look, read the articles. Even if you don't understand them, you get exposed to the buzzwords, and you'll have context the next time it comes around. That's why you want to, it's like how you learn a language. You immerse yourself in it. My son's been a ham since he was 16, but he wasn't very active until recently. His kids are grown now. I'm helping him with radios. Turns out he's a fearless climber, so all of the repeater owners love him. So he's got his own sub hobby.
He's climbing. Who would have thought?
Yeah, well, he borrowed my climbing harness because I've kind of hung it up, so to speak, being 73. And he's learning things from local hams, just from association. And it's not all technical. He's come to learn that when you go to a repeater site or something, it's 20% technical and 80% grunt work. We get a discount at a local repeater site on our rental fees because we clear the brush, because we're susceptible to fires, and they're very appreciative of that. Another place, we are in a WSP building, which he lets us occupy for free because we do building maintenance. We've sealed up holes in the old building. We stripped an old air conditioner off of it. We've taken dead antennas down for him because he's a new owner, and he's very appreciative of that. So that's not technical stuff, but it's being involved in the hobby and supporting it. I guess that's what I would say. Get involved.
That's what I did when I was a teenager as well. If you didn't have the technical chops, you at least had a strong back, and every club could use a strong back.
Or two, yeah. They have what they call winter field days, and out here where it doesn't snow much, they have field days whenever they feel like it. They'll bring your HF rig. We're going to meet at this park. Let's see what plays. A great place to get exposed to operating procedures, site setup. Here, take this rope and pull it out to that stake. It's all useful knowledge. It's not technical, but it's useful.
So just get involved and volunteer to do whatever work they need you to do. I've always found with ham radio, especially on field days or site work or something like that a lot of hams perhaps from their professions, and those professions can be anything like plumbing, welding, auto mechanics. There's always somebody that has some kind of skill that you need in a pinch. When you're 100 miles away from the nearest shop, they know how to improvise, right?
Oh, yeah. We have welders. I'm pretty good with computers, and I've helped some of the local hams who are less computer knowledgeable with problems, especially hooking up their AREDN stuff, because while it's quite a bit simpler than normal networking, sometimes you get backed into a corner and need some help. One of the hams I help with mesh is going to help me. He's going to re-weld they call them ballast mounts. I don't know if you've ever seen when you put an antenna on a tall building that's got a flat roof, they're kind of reluctant to let you drill holes in the roof. So this ballast mount is square. It's got a mast in the middle, and laying around the square on there are cinder blocks for ballast. And that's how you keep this thing from blowing away. So anyway, I got a ballast mount from a guy up in Lompoc, Northern California, but one corner is quite rusted, the angle iron. And this guy I'm helping with AREDN says, yeah, bring it over. I'll replace it for you, because he does welding. So, you've got all sorts of resources available.
Right, because hams are from every place. That's really one of the great things about it. We all have that thing in common. Orv, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. This was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about AREDN that I hadn't thought about. I had said to you before we started that I'm always trying to think of, what is the hook that's going to get the hams off of WhatsApp? And maybe if they're doing messaging on ham radio, then we'll actually start building another ham radio network. Anyway, with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73, and thank you for coming on the QSO Today podcast.
Oh, Eric, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and if people have questions about AREDN, drop me a note.
I'll make sure that there's a way to do that in the show notes page on the QSO Today podcast website.
Now I'm off to give my 63rd presentation this afternoon on AREDN.
73, Orv.
Bye, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Orv. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W6BI in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to get your ticket to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming up on March 25th, 2023 at 1800 PDT Pacific Daylight Time. This ticket is a super value at $15 for the entire weekend's activities, presentations, and networking, as well as access to the 30-day on-demand period. If you are busy on Expo weekend, you can still use your ticket to access all of the presentations and content during the 30 days that follow the Expo. See you at the Expo. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.